Okay, so welcome everybody to the 20th episode of the SFU Sports Analytics Group virtual seminar series. Today we are very privileged to have Alison Lukan joining us today in an interview style format that's going to be led by one of our SAG professors, Dr. Peter Chow-White, who's in the School of Communication here at Simon Fraser University. The title of today's session is Sports Analytics is a Science and an Art, a conversation with data journalist Alison Lukan. So the biography and the abstract are kind of one of the same for this session, so I'm going to read it out here. Alison Lukan is one of the most dynamic journalists and storytellers working in the sports analytics world. She believes sports should be studied as a science and an art and puts this belief into practice by combining analytics thinking and practice with sports journalism. Alison Lukan writes about the NHL, the Columbus Blue Jackets, and Ohio State women's and men's hockey for The Athletic. She has covered the Jackets for Fox Sports Ohio, the official team website, Yahoo Sports, and hockeyviz.com, among other outlets. She is well known on the conference circuit and has been a featured speaker at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. Ms. Lukan developed and honed her expertise in communication as a consultant for 20 years in strategic management, effective communication, organizational design, and knowledge management. Ms. Lukan earned her bachelor's degree in leadership studies from the University of Richmond, where she also served as the Spider mascot. It's a very interesting fun fact there that you'll have to tell us about in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll make sure to put it in speaker mode here and turn it over to Peter and Alison. Welcome, and this should be great. And thanks to everyone who's turned up today. We've got a great crowd.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Just one minor note, this is a total professor thing. Usually speakers give us their bios, and for anybody who noticed, practice twice in that second sentence, that wasn't Alison's fault, that was mine. She's a much better writer than that. So just in case anybody noticed a little tidbit there, I take full responsibility for that horrible sentence. Anyways, Alison, thank you very much for coming today. Alison and I chatted earlier this week, and I don't follow a lot of hockey, but when I was canvassing the group, trying to find out, who would be really good to talk to, Alison's name came up very quickly and first by one of our alumni from SFU who's with the Seattle Kraken now, Danny Chu. So I appreciate Danny putting us in touch. He wanted to be here this morning, but he got called into a Kraken meeting. So I guess those are important. So he's not here this morning, but he did send a question. So good morning, Alison. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so honored to be joining this group. I have such high respect for this group, and Danny in particular is such a star. So thank you so much for making time to have me. Yeah,
absolutely. So Alison and I met earlier, and there's a few things we want to touch on. This is a little bit different. We're used to having generally scientific presentations. This is more of a conversation. Alison also comes at this from a slightly different viewpoint than everybody else. And it's not so much different in the sense that it doesn't have as much to contribute as the scientific stuff. It's an absolutely integral part of the ecology of sports analytics, because they're the ones, the journalists, and especially the data journalists, which is interesting that those two things are split off. And maybe we'll get to that, because like data journalists and people who cover sports analytics seem to be in different people in the newsroom, which we didn't even touch on before. So we've got a lot of things to get to. So let's start off from the beginning, if you don't mind. Your career in sports journalism, it wasn't a straight line from college to sports writing. However, communication and strategy, as I found out when I was chatting with her and looking at her CV, which is really impressive, has been at the core of all of your careers. We have many students listening in today who are very curious about career paths after college. Because a lot of students look at people sitting on these screens and think, how am I ever going to be that person there? What they'll find out is that a lot of us sitting on these screens have, a very varied paths, different types of paths, but it takes a long time to get to where we're at. And so I guess a lot of them are interested in how you got started. Can you tell us a bit about your college background, just to go back and connect with our audience here, and how you got started in communication strategy related fields?
Yeah, so showing my age a little bit as we get into how I got started, but I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. That's where I'm from. And when it came to my personal college experience, the concept of leadership was something that had always interested me. And back when I was looking at colleges, leadership meant military. Leadership meant government. That was where you were hearing about study and work on the topics of leadership. And the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, was launching what was at the time the first of its kind, in a leadership studies major. So I found that. I also, living a little bit north, wanted a little bit warmer weather, and wanted to be at a smaller school. And so I decided to pursue this leadership degree. And I must say, I think an easy way to think of it, particularly at that time, was ironically an MBA without the math. But it was really focused on understanding not just leading, but following and team building and the application of leadership in a bunch of different contexts. And so that really set me up for what came next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So part of that program was trying out for the mascot. Was that totally related?
Yes. So yeah, and the Richmond mascot is a spider mascot. So it was just a lark. It was a fun thing to do. I actually wrote a story about it last summer. Just something fun to do in a way. People who know me tease me and say I like to help bring people together and bring teams together. And that was the perfect way for me to do it without anyone knowing it was me.
So when you left, you didn't go straight into sports writing. You moved into consulting for organizations, taking which is great because it's directly related to your degree. I'm assuming with the work you did. I want to kind of focus on communication as kind of the core of this conversation, because communication, storytelling, translation of data and things like that is super important in the space and often an overlooked part of the space. Although it's an assumed part of everything that we do, but we don't often talk about it and put it on the table as a direct conversation. So what did you learn about effective communication? And maybe you can tell us a bit about what you think effective communication is, and how did you apply that in your professional practice with organizations?
Yeah, so a couple moments still stick out to me all these years later. And one of them is we took negotiations class in university, which at the time was quite unique to have such an experience. And I remember going through the negotiation exercise, and then we digested the results of winning versus successful negotiation. And sometimes those are very different outcomes. And that kind of stuck with me. And then I moved into what was at the time IT consulting. And again, showing my age, this was implementing client server technology. This was breakthrough stuff, guys, was client server technology. And as I started to go through that and work on that side, work on the database side, and we'd go through user acceptance testing was a big buzzword back then. And we'd go through these kinds of exercises. It really came to the forefront for me that success wasn't rooted in the technology. Success was rooted in the process and the human acceptance of the process and the human acceptance of the technology. And so there was a beginning of a communication there. And as I moved up the chain, if you will, in terms of elevating the kind of work I was doing and the people I was working with, it went from implementation to talking about projects to do, quoting projects to do, talking with leaders of organizations. And there again, that communication had to become more broad, understanding what technology could do, understanding what your teams needed, understanding what your people needed, and realizing that communication isn't just throwing your message out and hoping that it's received. It's a multifaceted, organic environment that really takes a lot to succeed. And from there, I started to find some certifications in communication specifically and do work around that as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, one of the things about the sports analytics space that we find that I think is directly related to what you're doing is just that these are inherently multidisciplinary teams within an organization. Mm-hmm. You have people who do data, you have people who do leadership, you have people who coach, and you have players. So there's many different what we call stakeholders within that community. Because we all speak the same language, there's an assumption that everybody understands each other. Mm-hmm. But each community has its own way of talking about things, its own culture, its own jargon, its own way of thinking about how to communicate and shorthand. And often that shorthand takes place for things that don't need to be said. But when you communicate between teams, that seems to be that's a different skill set. How did you, and you notice this a lot in the sports analytics world, and we're going to get to that conversation in a sec, but this really sets the table for that. How did you see that as a thing, as a challenge, but also as an opportunity within organizations?
Yeah, one of the first things I would always do with clients is I would sit down, the leaders or the stakeholders that had brought us in as consultants, and say, let's talk about your lexicon. Let's talk about your language. Surely somewhere, particularly with these bigger organizations, there's that document somewhere, right, that has every single acronym. And it's taking that document and throwing it out the window. And, you know, in application to analytics, you know, this is even the math side of it. We live in it, we breathe it, we understand it. But it's not a language that everyone can appreciate. I think about this even in hockey. I tease people who tease me about being in analytics that the language of hockey is just as strange. Why do we say a goaltender stands on his head? He's literally not standing on his head. This makes no sense, but it is terminology that has been accepted by the community. So I think that when we talk about, to your point, bringing different communities together, and sometimes a community can be one or two people. A community is not necessarily a large entity. We have to stop and say, if we have to be bold enough, I should say, that when we hear something we don't understand, we say, hold, please, can you tell me what that means? And we have to be prepared to receive the same question back and really try and take our language to a common sense. If I bring in Joe Average in this environment, they're going to understand the words that I'm using.
So when we have these different stakeholders, the other part of the equation in all this, aside from language, is also hierarchies and power relationships within an organization. So while the impetus to understand each other is on the listener, not all listeners are made equal. Not all listeners have the time to listen to others, especially people in subordinate types of fields. And sports analytics generally, and especially analytics professionals, generally don't have a seat at the leadership table. So, the impetus on leadership is not to sit there and listen to the sports analytics folks, especially people down the hierarchy, at a length of time to understand them. It's the impetus is on the folks who are trying to get the leadership to understand how they hear things, how things can be translated in a way that they would understand. So instead, so you kind of have to be able to translate that. What's your experience with that? Where have you seen that as an effective way? And what are some of the mechanisms that you noticed, or the steps for someone who's working in sports analytics?
Yeah, and I would challenge a little bit. I think when this comes to my leadership side, when we step outside the topic of analytics, any good leader does need to help develop their follower, if you will, their employee, their team member. And so if you have a tremendously valuable asset in a human being, whatever their skill set is, and they just need to learn and have the aptitude to learn, to be able to get to that seat at the table, that is a little bit on the leader too. I will push back there. And I think that's a harmful piece that's going on in sports right now, is there's so much, I know the guy who knew the guy who I worked with over here 10 years ago, and we're not broadening our approach to see who we should look at to bring to the table. But to answer your question, I do. At the end of the day, we are all accountable for what we push for, what we strive to become. And I think, again, the lessons really have to be respect and appreciate that the work that we put in that is highly technical, and this could be said for really any technical field, is valuable, meaningful, and not discounted. But we need to look at those people we're talking to. We can take these cues in many ways. It can be a formal interview of, tell me how you like to receive information. It can also be cues like, how do you see that person take notes? Do they get more engaged when they see something visual versus when they're presented with a document? Do they like to see a play on video? Do they like a table? Do they like short? Do we see their attention span start to shorten? We use these cues to tailor how we communicate the takeaways that we have. And oftentimes we are all so intimately familiar with the findings of our work that if we're doing our job and taking the time to do that translation, we should be able to narrow down the things that each audience needs to hear. And that's an important point too. We may have 10 findings. 10 findings don't need to go to every single person in our audience, potentially. Depending on the audience, we need to say which findings are relevant to this audience. So understanding their needs, understanding their communication preferences and tendencies is a huge platform for success.
Okay, great. I want to get to, when you first became interested in sports analytics and get to some of the more the topic at hand. I just want to also let the audience know that if you have questions, please send them into the chat. If I see them come up, this is supposed to be interactive. You don't have to wait till the end. We'll try and integrate them as best we can. So how did you get interested in sports analytics? Is that lately? Is it something you're kind of interested in? Like, where did that come from?
It's funny. It came from I think just the way my mind works, and I have loved math. I've always had an aptitude for it. I'm certainly not near as smart as many of the people on this call. To be sure, I know how brilliant Danny is, coming from this background. But, I was watching hockey and I was looking at the stats that were publicly presented to us in the arena. And I said, this doesn't tell me everything about what's actually going on. Ironically, in sports analytics, we're often teased or sometimes almost negatively said, well, watch the game, don't look at your numbers. But it was looking at the game that for myself and for many others in my field or on the hardcore analytics field, that's what drove us to the numbers. Help me understand what's going on. So that was really a big push for me. And then I think the other thing that was relevant was that for me, breaking into writing without a formal writing background, without a lot of credibility in that sense, completely switching fields, I needed my perception of play to really be defensible. And so I needed numbers to do that. And I didn't trust the publicly available numbers. I needed more to support the kinds of topics and questions I wanted to explore.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, most people that work in journalism tend to go to J schools, like journalism schools. And so, and so your move into that is an unusual one. And did you have an aha moment when you decided you needed to pivot into journalism, like moving from consulting into journalism? Because that's a big move. That's a career change, right?
It is a career change. And for anyone who hasn't read the book Range, I highly recommend it. It's a tremendous book about skill sets that translate and the beauty in someone who maybe does pickpocket across a couple different careers in their lifetime. Tremendous book. But for me, it really was finding the passion and seeing that consulting was something I was really good at, but it wasn't something that I was super passionate about. And then I was able to realize I wanted to do this. And then, to be honest, I had to set a plan in place. I had to be financially prepared. I had to be logistically prepared. I had to have a job to do it. So I then had to have a plan in place. And it took a few years to make the full pivot, but it really was a passion project.
Right. So it was more of a gradual approach. It was intentional, but gradual to get into there. Okay. Yeah. That's the thing as you tend to get on as you get further away from college, let's put it that way. It's a nicer way to put it.
As we get old, it's okay.
Exactly. Making big pivots, starts to have larger risks in life.
100%.
So 20s is a great time to try lots of different things, because, it's not huge changes in your circumstances, but once you start to get the momentum into your 30s, it becomes a lot difficult to do. So it's amazing you made that. As you're making that move into professional sports and writing and sports analytics, of course, professional sports in general hasn't always been welcoming to women. Sports analytics is a relatively new field in sports and journalism, and has had similar issues with diversity and inclusion. So how did you think, first of all, strategically and personally, about how you're going to pivot into this career? Because obviously you're very thoughtful. You didn't just go in blind, like you knew that this was coming. So how did you think about that? How did you prepare?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that in some ways I was unprepared. I'm a little bit of a bull in a china shop when I see something I want. And I'm thankful that my parents encouraged me to do anything I wanted to do. And I believed that. So I started to do that. What I fear is that the realities of a lot of these situations today rightly intimidate people from taking the steps I did. I don't know if I would have taken the steps I did, understanding the full reality of that situation. I think that there is not enough diversity, period, in so many fields, particularly in the STEM fields, particularly in the analytics fields, and definitely in the sports fields. The ramifications are real. They can be scary, and there are things that we have to do to protect ourselves. But I would encourage people who maybe consider themselves not in the majority, find the people like you or who you identify with in your field. Everyone I have come across who doesn't look like the standard old white male that unfortunately is the predominant culture in many, particularly sports fields. If you can find someone who shares your experience, we are all so willing to do almost anything to help others come up and make more space for us.
So how did you, having being proactive is one thing, being having some, moving yourself forward without, and moving through obstacles is one thing. Not everybody is able to do that,
That's right.
But so how did you find people to connect to that were able to help sort of, as you're moving forward, help pull you in and provide mentorship and things like that? Because that's one of the cultural issues is just not finding connections. And so how did you find those connections?
Right. And again, this is where I push back, because there is certainly work we can do to find connections for ourselves. but I challenge leadership in any of these fields or organizations that are not diverse enough. They need to be making the space. They need to be going and finding these individuals and saying, hey, you're welcome here. And we're going to do the things that are necessary to make you feel welcome. But, you know, quite frankly, again, I would Google. When I Googled women in hockey, there are things that came up. I was able to find resources. And again, that welcoming culture is only getting stronger in today's world. And I would also, I can't believe I'm saying this, encourage careful use of social media. Because again, you can find like-minded individuals. You can find individuals sharing a common experience. And so many of my best resources are women that I've never even met in person. They are women, though, that have been tremendous resources to me, allies, defenders, sounding boards, advocates, counselors on my work product alone. And so I would say that too. I think that we are fortunate that those of us who are strong enough to push through, because not everyone should have to be, are starting to find identifiable ways to find others like us.
Okay, great. So getting into the, once you did start writing stories and things like that, you know, I read in your speaker bio for MIT, you know, Sloan Conference, you believe sports should be studied as a science and an art. And I found this really intriguing. And that's why I made it the title of this talk. It's interesting. What do you mean by this? And how do you do this in your writing?
Yeah, so, you know, it does go back to how I came upon the idea of analytics, is that it wasn't, and I'm feeding a stereotype here. I wasn't looking at data. I was looking at a game and looking for answers beyond. And I think that we need to be accountable in almost everything that we study, but particularly sport, to recognize that the eye test and the data work hand in hand. They must work hand in hand, not just to truly understand what we should explore in the data and also what the data tells us, but quite frankly, when we talk about acceptance, part of the reason why people love sport is because it feeds something in us that is emotional. It's entertainment. This is not saving the world. This is hockey. This is basketball. This is soccer, what have you. So we need to not negate the emotional connection that happens with sport. We need to feed it. And so understanding that I can give you every predictable value in the world, and we know this in the world we live in, data still is never going to be 100% correct. We need to allow space to realize that that degree of variability is the art. It is when the player does the incredible thing that you never could dream happen, and that he or she may never be able to do again. Recognizing that the science of the human doing incredible things is in some ways magic, and we can measure a lot of it, but we have to allow space for that magic and that creativity as well.
So, so moving from data to communicating data, audience and coaches, we're going to come back to that earlier conversation, but in the specific case here, this is a critical part of sports analytics practice, as we talked about, and you focus this every day in your stories. Alan's asked a question here that actually works really well with this next one I have is, you know, what are some ways you do this effectively? If you can be as specific as possible, and how do you find ways to connect sound data with different audiences and subject area experts? And Alan is asking us along these lines. He says, do you have any ideas on how to break the old school line of thinking and connect those who see analytics as just numbers? So one, there's the everyday practice of taking complex information and translating, but then you got to fight the buy-in, those who don't want to buy in. So how do you, and those are two different things, but they also obviously related. How do you do that? How do you manage that?
Yeah, so it goes back to that language idea. You know, there is a necessary and essential space for the technical writing that must be done to support the analytical work that we are doing. That is essential. However, if your audience is not that, back to that idea of what is a group's lexicon, use that. So an example is this. There is a concept in hockey, and I'm never sure how many people may or may not be hockey fans, so I'll go to the very basic level.
There's a Canada, so it's a pretty good assumption that there'll be a high.
But you, sir, are not.
But please don't reveal me, okay? Not the rule.
So there's a concept in hockey analytics called the shot assist, which is measuring the player who passes the puck to the player who shoots the puck. Right now, we only track assists if the puck goes in the net and is a goal. A shot assist is a play that leads to any shot attempt at the net. So there was tremendous work going on in this field analytically at the time. And I was compelled by this. I thought this was interesting. I made sure, and this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, I made sure that I understood exactly what I was trying to prove, investigate, or reveal. Dug into the data. What players, which players I should say, on the Columbus Blue Jackets, the team I cover, were performing well in this measure of shot assists. So I had my data, I had my information, and then I took that into the room. So I took that into the coach's office, into press availability, into the locker room. And I didn't go in and say, you know, when a player passes the puck to another player, it's called a shot assist. And there's a high likelihood that that player is going to be more effective offensively. Do you agree? That's not what I said. I said, hey, Alexander Wenberg over here is off the charts when it comes to putting the puck on another player's stick for that player to get a shot off. Is that a thing? Like, that's literally what I said. Is that a thing? Does it matter? Does it not matter?
Yeah.
Is it a big deal? Is it a skill? And because I didn't know, like, I know what the numbers tell me, but now I need to understand how it actually happens.
Right.
So I went into the people who did it. I talked to them in their language.
Yeah.
So when I wrote the story, all of the quotes that I wrote were not mine. They were not the math of it. They were, here's what Alexander Wenberg does well, and here's why it matters in the words of his coach and his teammates. And I supported it with a little bit of data, but in a pretty table and in video. Everyone loves video. There is nothing more powerful than saying, I'm going to tell you about this thing. Now look, here's a player doing the thing. And then it connects.
Right. So it seems like like data on its, like, so there's different methods of representing data. Obviously there's, you know, it's the text. There's visualizations of some sort, and usually those visualizations can actually be very complex themselves, or they can be very infographic-y, which is really funny because a lot of people poo-poo infographics, but I think they're an incredibly effective communication tool for complex ideas to a general audience, not an expert audience, but a general audience. And then there's also the video part. So the video part is, so that stuff's not easy, right? Like that takes time, it takes effort. Like, so how do you decide when, you know, when that's going to be effective, and when you're going to use those, and when do you rely on sort of, you know, more quicker modes of doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple ways to come across that. Sometimes the fun is in dissecting a play. You see a great play. I think back, this is probably the thing that the Blue Jackets are most notable for, and it was notable analytically as well, was when the Blue Jackets swept the Tampa Bay Lightning 2 years ago in round 1 of the playoffs. There was a particular power play that occurred that was 4 minutes long. Everyone was crazy. Everyone was like, this is insane. Look at all these things happening. So then I went to the video, rewatched the video after the game, and started looking for things that I have learned. Because again, we have to keep our pulse on this field. What are the topics that are interesting? What are the findings? What are we looking at? How do we value players in this situation? Do I see any of that as I watch this video? So there's that kind of scenario. There's also, very similar to a research project, there are topics that I study over a season or over multiple seasons. I'm very interested in a very aggressive penalty kill. We like to call it a power kill. So anytime I see an example of a power kill, I know to grab the video. And then the worst example is when you know a player did something and now you have to go find the video. And oftentimes that's asking colleagues or players or coaches, hey, do you remember a time when so-and-so did this? Or you might be lucky enough that they volunteer it, or you just have to sit down and watch a bunch of video. You just have to.
So you just got to put in the work. It's long hours. Yes.
It is. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you, what are some of your favorite, you've been talking about certain analytics that you like a lot, and, you know, hockey is one of those ones that has a reputation among the big four sports of being slower to adopt in analytics. You know, here in Vancouver, the Canucks were, you know, infamous for this. It felt like, although those of us in the sports analytics group who got a chance to talk to the Canucks a few years ago, you know, they described a slightly different story. So, you know, perception versus reality can be different because teams are not advertising what they're doing. You know, where do you think hockey has done? First of all, do you agree it's been slower? And where do you think hockey has done well in the last?
Well, yes, hockey has been slower. It has, for sure. That is not only a nature of the teams and what's happening in the teams or not happening, but it is a nature of the game. It's a very fluid game. Fortunately, hockey is starting to leverage a lot of the lessons learned from football, or North American soccer, as we call it. because of that fluidity of a 5-man or a multi-man player unit playing all together and isolating out the impact therein. But it's also an issue of data. And, this is the big thing. And this is what the hockey world is really waiting on, almost waiting for it to be bad news for us in the public space, is that for the first time, the NHL is going to be getting player and puck tracking data. And, this is where a team like Seattle, that's building a tremendous analytics department, I can think of a couple other teams that are building their departments the right way, are recognizing, and we all see this, I'm sure, in the work that we do. This doesn't mean this data comes in a pretty packaged dashboard and you get to click here and look at this and this. You're going to have to process that data. You're going to have to manipulate that data, clean that data, make sure it's presentable before you even begin the first step of your analysis. So it's going to be a tremendous amount of work. Where we are in terms of what metrics work, it's a shame we're a little stagnant right now, because the only thing we can do quickly is based on what the NHL puts out real time, which is all shot based. We don't know where players are. We don't know any of that stuff. So a lot of our work is shot based, which has to do with possession, likelihood to win games, things of that nature, looking at trailing states, leading states, and different actions using those variables. We are fortunate that we have members in the community. Corey Schneider is an individual who comes to mind, who on a global level is tracking games for more specific data, for questions that I think are going to start to matter. Not just how many pucks go off player sticks, but how do teams get into zones? How do they get out of zones? How do they transition the puck? How do defenses set up? How do offenses attack? Those areas are sadly lacking. We can start to dig into that, but it takes time because it's all manual tracking data.
So, this sounds like the tracking data, like it did with basketball, is going to be like do a sea change within the community. Like, how ready do you think NHL is for this? Are they ready to ask the right questions? But more importantly, are they ready to develop a way to figure out what those questions are? Because the big data approach is different than the traditional scientific approach. The traditional scientific approach is you ask questions, collect data, and do the analysis. But the big data approach is you collect data first and ask questions later. How ready do you think teams are of what especially maybe the Columbus team? Columbus and Seattle may seem to be very different. What do you think that's going to do, and are they ready for this?
Yeah, and I think this answer goes right back to this art versus science. We need teams to be ready from a true scientific, analytical, mathematical perspective, as I mentioned, to handle the data, manipulate the data, and work with it to provide reliable results. That's the science. On the other side, the art, the value differentiator. There's going to be value differentiators over here. And then the other side of the value differentiators are going to be, what are the questions asked? And this goes back to why we need to watch the game. Your data might tell you that, player 38 is tremendous at going over the boards faster than any other player on the rink, but does it matter? And if your team leadership or the people who are asking the questions think it matters and it actually doesn't, think of all the time you've wasted. So the art, the intellectual ability to explore new ideas, explore the game, and then again, communicate with your data team, vice versa, there is where the real value is going to be. You're going to differentiate yourself as an organization on having a strong, capable, robust, in terms of skill set, doesn't mean you need necessarily 20 people, but robust data team. And then you need a group of people, they may be in the same team, but you need a group of people who are knowing what questions to ask and learning from those questions and elevating the conversation constantly. Teams are not ready.
Yeah. So and you mentioned Seattle a couple of times. You say that they seem to be doing a very interesting job, or a different job of creating this organization, because basically, sports is like a club. It's less like an efficiently run organization. It's more like a club. Hey, I know this person. I know this person. Yeah. People float between different places. They get hired. They get fired in one place. They're hired in another. It's who you know type thing. But you seem to think that Seattle has a benefit of coming from that, but also building from the ground up. So can you tell us a bit about what you've noticed with them?
Yeah, and I think your point about building from the ground up, that clean slate really allows for an opportunity to do things differently. And I think what's really cool about what Seattle has done is that they're still leveraging people, you know, because of people who do a good job, but they brought in Alexander Mandrycki, who comes from a data space. She wasn't even a hockey fan. I think it may not even be 10 years ago, but she is a brilliant person when it comes to data. And quite frankly, in my opinion, she's one of the best communicators and analytical thinkers I've ever met. And she, to her credit, is building that kind of team that I was speaking of. There are people who are managing the applications that hold the data. There are people who are managing the data, making sure it's clean, making sure the databases are organized properly. And then there are people asking the analytical questions from a mathematical perspective, sitting on top of it. And on top of that, going back to this diversity question that we talked about, this team is incredibly diverse. There are people from many racial backgrounds, both genders, many genders. Of course, we certainly don't have to disclose our genders to one another. But I think that this too changes the analytical space. You and I shared a story with you when we were talking. I put out a study on Twitter of something I had looked at, and some individual responded and said, you know, if you ran a simple script, you could figure that out. And I said, that's what I did. And there was no presumption that whether it's that I was in media or that I look like this or what have you, that I would have even thought to do it, or let alone be able to do it. And then of course, once I said I did it, then this person wanted to know how. And this went into a big direct message conversation where I got this multi-paragraph explanation of who this individual was and his background and this and that and the other thing. And I simply responded and said, you know, that's great, but think about it. You just thought it was valuable for me to understand your whole background to justify what you did. And you never, ever considered that my background could look like one that was capable of writing a data script to handle this data. Yeah. And so in addition to the skill sets that this Seattle team brings, this is changing the visual, the racial, the sexual identity perspective of what a team can look like, whether it's in data or not, what team employees can look like.
So, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times that, well, there's always this relationship between the individual doing things and the context and the culture in which they're going into, and then the responsibility of leadership. So what has Seattle, how has Seattle done that? What have you noticed about, they're a team like any other team, except they're an expansion team. They're not a team that moved from one place to the other. So they don't have that kind of baggage. So what is it in Seattle's leadership do you think is different?
Yeah, and I will say too, there are some other teams that, we can't share all of our inside baseball things we know. There are some other teams that are doing some good work here, both analytically and on a diversity focus. But it is part of their culture. If you follow that team, they're very open about agendas tied to making sure that they are sensitive to the environment that they are in, that they are zero impact, that they are sensitive to Indigenous people because they're taking some of the land that was previously occupied and owned by Indigenous people. They are proud and they celebrate the diversity within their organization. They've made it a mandate and they're really trying. And I think furthermore, there are people living the mandate. Alex is someone who I know most directly, so I speak to her ability, but I certainly would without a doubt credit everyone in that organization's leadership, because if not everyone's doing it, it wouldn't be happening. And it is in fact happening.
Right. I mean, much like data and, and having good data and good analysis and good impact on that data, a lot of it starts in design, right? Designing the data, designing the organizations, designing a culture of an organization is not unlike designing the data. It's like, this is the type of thought that needs to go in the beginning, not kind of Forrest Gumping your way through at the end, or when things go wrong, when
That's
you're
right.
called sort of thing, right?
That's right.
So speaking, so one thing about that Seattle's gonna have to deal with and everybody's gonna have to deal with is that this tracking data you mentioned, just getting back to design, like baseball releases data publicly. The NBA keeps it very private. So there's different approaches to these things. What do you think the NHL is going to do with that? Do you think they'll release it and follow baseball? Do you think they'll follow basketball? I mean, what do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, unfortunately, at least myself and some that I speak with, we're a little pessimistic. The little that we've seen publicly has been trivia. And I'm sure that we've all been in that space where once someone knows that you know some data about something, like, how many times did a team win on Tuesday or whatever might be a trivial, we all know the difference between descriptive and predictive data. And oftentimes people want the descriptive and don't understand that it doesn't matter. It's just descriptive data. And so what we've seen from the NHL that they've shared publicly is descriptive data and or data we don't yet know is prescriptive. And it is seemingly geared towards betting, which I get it. The NHL is a business. The NHL wants to make money. But it's, how fast was a player skating? Or, I'm trying to think of another question, how many seconds was so-and-so on the ice before a goal was scored? These are all prop bets. These are all ways the league can make money. I understand that, but that is not data that necessarily moves the analytical conversation forward. And we're not necessarily confident that we're going to see much of the raw data or even slightly packaged data available to us that maybe isn't gambling oriented. We may not even get the gambling oriented data. It might be presented just as results, not the data itself.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sensing that you obviously feel that this should be public.
100%.
But of course, you understand, as we all say, as analytics and scientists, we understand why, corporations don't release it, but we don't appreciate it because it's not the culture that we're used to. So if it is kept in private though, like, how do you think this will impact innovation? Because if the NHL is lagging, but they want to move ahead in innovation, but they decide that a private model is a way to do that, and not just private within keeping it inside the NHL, but protecting it from each other, which always baffles me when I talk to people about this, because two people is really hard to innovate when you have two people, right? When you have a community, it's very different. So how do you think this will impact innovation and the NHL's desire, like the Seattle Kraken, to move forward with this stuff?
Yeah, ironically, I really think, and for anyone who's looking into going into sports analytics, one of the pieces of advice that you'll get from almost anyone in this space is do work and make it public. Mm-hmm. So I think that by the league, if the league decides not to make much of this public, they're actually hurting their own innovation, their own staffing choices, because so many of these people who've done some of the foundational work in the public space now work for teams because they brought attention to their abilities, to their skill set, to their relationship to think the game in an analytical way. And, so I think it hurts these organizations. At the Blue Jackets, last time is irrelevant. This past year has gone by and whatever, but 2 winters ago, we did have an analytics conference at the Blue Jackets arena. And one of the things that we fought for was a data contest where teams could come and hear the work that public individuals did with data that was given to them from a tracking resource. And we demanded that those individuals be able to make their work public after the fact, because this is where your innovation is going to come from. You're not going to stop smart people who have a purpose. They're going to find a way to get the data, even if it just takes longer. And I think that the teams hurt themselves. And I also, back to that art versus science thing, putting the data out, if the right questions aren't asked, who cares? Who cares? So maybe hold some back, fine. But I really do believe that it's not one data point that's going to make the difference, the tactical advantage. It's going to be the questions asked and the application thereafter.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a question from Christina, Ryan, Miles, and May, a group question here.
Hey.
That's along this line. So speaking of just different types of data, and their question is, even before video analysis was well structured, there was a time when even shot data was difficult to get. Because we often think that the more extensive data is sexier and much more interesting, and that has to have insights just because it's big. That's not always the case. So did you find space for innovation when box score data ruled the day? Like how was that innovated with?
Well, and that's the funny thing. Box score data is literally the foundation of hockey analytics right now. Mm-hmm. When people push back on hockey analytics, we're like, do you see all that stuff on a box score? That's literally all that the very brilliant people in the hockey space are scraping, pulling into their tools, applying their analysis, and turning into analytical results. Mm-hmm. There's very little, there's some thinkers who are doing it in the level of application, but as I mentioned before, it's this shot data is where everything's starting from. And a fun fact for you all, last season, so there are people in the analytics space who do shot maps in addition to shot data analysis. It was the people doing shot level analysis based on publicly available data from the league that discovered a bug in the league's tracking software for shots. The league did not find it. Wow. The people in the public analytics space did. And so again, back to that other question as well, this is the value. And so a more simplistic example back to the box score, if I may make sure I drive this point home, one of the most predictive values we have in hockey is called Corsi. And it's been proven mathematically to be very predictive. There's a variation of it, Fenwick, which is just one less value. Corsi is if you look at a box sheet and you add shots, block shots, miss shots. That's Corsi. And it took someone saying, I want to look at every single puck that goes towards the net. Can I get that? Yes, I can. I've got it. Now let's do some math on top of it. So yes, that's all we have. That's why we're limited, but look at what we've accomplished. And so again, my mind goes to think about what we could accomplish if we had even a little bit more.
So we're looking at, once we get into the role of the community in this, like the community obviously was, that's kind of when you release things, it gets eyes on data. Is not just about analytics, but it's also the data itself. You can find bugs in it. And like you said, I mean, I've worked with data that, certain organizations didn't want to have. There's lots of ways to get things. Sometimes you have to be patient. Sometimes you just have to design things that, make them think it's just a regular person going and checking things out. But there's lots of ways to do it, right? So it's almost like it's a cat and mouse game sometimes with this type of stuff. So I get lots of questions from people about getting into sports analytics and people who are interested in these sorts of things. I get questions that maybe we can talk about in a minute about how to get into it, either as most people in this group will want to be sort of moving into team-based stuff or otherwise. But the community itself is an important place to find your way into different parts of the sports analytics world. And so if someone got interested in sports analytics today and want to work in it, they may look up the Sloan Conference and they see a very vibrant and corporate driven image of the space, right? They see what's happening with teams and people with nice suits on, and you've sat on those panels, and it looks very, very good. In Canada, we look at it and we think it looks very slick and very American, but it's just because it's done so well. However, the pathways in various sports started out as actually more of a grassroots, like sports analytics was more of a grassroots community-driven story by everyday people. The story of Moneyball that often gets missed and not paid attention to is that it wasn't a corporate-driven initiative. It was something that started 20 years ago by often attributed in a very sort of typical storyline about the inventor, although it wasn't, is that it grew. It was a community grassroots movement through the 80s and 90s using the internet, people going to games and collecting data on their own and sharing that sort of thing, right? But so that's mainly that's the basis of it. It's a grassroots movement is how I would describe it. So I mean, how would you characterize the world and people today of sports analytics, and what's the role of community in that world?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'm living proof that I'm doing what I'm doing in part because I found that community. And I mentioned, online connection, finding groups or clubs that match your interests. But the hockey community has this tremendous subculture, if you will, called Hockey Analytics Conferences, often abbreviated as HAC. There's been one in Vancouver. There have been a couple in Seattle. There have been a couple in Vancouver, a couple in Seattle. Sometimes teams put them on, sometimes individuals put them on. But these are all driven by individuals in the community saying, let's come together, let's share ideas, let's let people learn, and let's have conversation of how we move the ball forward. That is how my journey began. I drove to a hack given at Carnegie Mellon, put on by Sam Ventura, who now is lead on analytics. He's very high in the front office of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And Andrew Thomas, who is now the lead in terms of handling this hockey data for the company SMT, which is a sports data company in general, which is a great sidebar. This is a great avenue also to continue to consider if you're interested in sports analytics. There are companies, outside organizations that support teams with their data, a great avenue to pursue. But going to that conference and not just being impressed by the work being done, but being welcomed, feeling comfortable and feeling okay, wanting to learn more and asking the questions that you might feel basic, but being welcomed in that way. This is persistent in the hockey analytics community. It's something I'm tremendously thankful for, and something that I really fight to uphold, because we've seen so much great work come out of that culture.
Yeah. So along those lines, Shrey has a question here as well, and people have been putting great comments in the chat. I can't get to all of them, but people are really engaging in this discussion, which is really cool. Like, these conferences are important places, not just for HAC, and some of us in the SAG here and on in these presentations. We've been part of hacks and we've helped organize them. We've worked with the Canucks on them and things like that. So we've seen firsthand how important they could be. But these conferences also have more than just hockey as well. There's lots of larger sports conferences like Sloan, et cetera. You also, Stray says, like Alison mentioned, how hockey and soccer are analogous in terms of fluidity. Some of the soccer analytic pieces cross the fence and are applied in ice hockey. Ice hockey as opposed to field hockey, I suppose. How are cross-sports insights perceived in the ice hockey community, especially club leadership? And how does the sport domain knowledge plays a role in being better at the analytics in that sport? Shrey has worked in soccer a lot and is very new to hockey, so this question's a bit personal as well. You know.
Yeah, I think that, and I probably don't have the most robust experience in this, but the analysts I know who are working for teams who are some of the most highly regarded in the field have leveraged soccer findings. I don't know that translation to, I think where your question was going, is happening necessarily at the organizational level, but I think that the organization, whether it's intentional or whether they're lucking into it, are finding people who are leveraging cross-sport learnings. And until recently, I think it was a few years ago, Kroenke Sports, which is the organization that owns all of the major league sports in Denver, they actually had an intentional cross-sport analytics team. And so that is a group that at the time, at the least, understood not only the synergies, but also the efficiencies in putting all of those people together. So to me, it feels a little more individual driven, but the individuals are certainly not negating the opportunity to leverage across sports.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they have a lot more in common than differences. You know, it's like coaching kids in sports. I found it's like 90% of coaching kids in various sports is just knowing how to coach kids.
Yeah,
whether
exactly.
It's hockey or whether it's soccer, whether it's baseball, there's a lot more things in common in organizing, especially at that grassroots, junior level. But so, it's other parts of the community is, the media, social media plays also an incredibly important role in this, in developing and connecting people and things like that. So how, and also as places for people like content producers like yourself to express themselves or to do different things in different spaces. So how have you, like, what role does Twitter play for you? And obviously in your podcast, like what role does that play for you in this?
Well, Twitter is great and Twitter is terrible. You will inevitably have things picked up that you never dreamed would get picked up. I shared with you, Peter, that for those of you who may know the Mike Milbury story, yes, I am the person that tweeted the video that was the final straw. That was me. But I think it is at the end of the day, it's very powerful. And I think it's a great way, particularly with what our world has gone through these past now almost 15 months. It's a great way to stay connected, to share information, to find community when maybe that community isn't instantly nearby geographically. It's one of my favorite things is to be with my people on my Twitter community. And I joke that things get picked up that you don't want, but also sometimes you'll dash off a piece very quickly, and all of a sudden you have names that you would never in a million years expect, in my instance, to be reading my work, commenting back. And that's very powerful, not just to know your work was shared, but those are the things that keep you going sometimes when it's a little harder day. So I think that, I think that I will say, and we talked about this, if you are in a minority community, there are certainly some security conditions that you should put in mind and things you should think through to protect yourself. That's important. But I do believe used responsibly. The rule I live by is I would never type anything I wouldn't say to someone's face. And that social media more times than not has been very powerful for me professionally and also personally. Nice.
So I'm just being cognizant of time, your time and everybody's time. So Dave, it's 11 o'clock. Did you want to end at 11? Alison has a few more minutes. Can we go for a few more minutes? Alison, what do you think about that?
Yep, I have about 10 to 15 more minutes. Yep.
Okay, so let's try another maybe 5 minutes. Dave, does that sound good for you?
Yeah, as long as everyone's hanging out and Alison's good to go, let's keep it going.
Sure. I find it really difficult to, I can't see people's hands go up and stuff. So if you have another question, please either maybe make an audible or just put it in the chat. I think the chat function's been working really well for that. The last thing, the one thing I would like to talk about here is where do you think professional hockey can support like us, the academic world, in terms of, and the citizen scientist community better? You know, what is in it for pro teams to be doing this? Like, why is this important to them? They usually don't look out, and and a lot of times they're very oppositional to fans, and part of that's a club mentality. Like, where can they do this, and what's at stake for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I wish people would listen to me. I wish I thought I knew the entire answer, which I don't. But you know, I think that just like any outreach, I think connecting with the community, we see some teams starting to do initiatives around reinforcing STEM. I have seen teams like the Columbus Blue Jackets do initiatives where they bring schools in and talk about the science of hockey, making nerdy sport cool, if you will, and vice versa. I think that's a start, but I do think we are still in hockey, particularly facing a bit of that burden of the old guard. Hockey, and I have said it to their faces, so I don't mind saying it here, hockey is staffed, as you said as well, mainly by hockey men. It's who you know, it's who played the game. And I think that changing that culture is so important. We've talked about the importance of communication a little bit here. And one of the really big fears I have is that we as a community are not allowed to flex our communication muscle to show we have that skill set. I think what we're seeing right now is that hockey presumes a non-analytical thinker needs to come in to provide the communication layer. And in some cases that may be correct. Every organizational culture is different. Have
you seen that somewhere happening already?
Like we're seeing Arizona is doing that. It's a role that I have advocated for and fought for years. I'm finally going to write it up as soon as this season is over. It's called the translator role. But what I think is very important to understand about that role is that it's not necessarily a separate individual from either the hockey world or the analytics world. It can come from either. Or it could sit independent. It's the point of having these communication skills to translate information back and forth. And I appreciate Arizona's hire. I think it's great that they're even bringing awareness to the light to connect the worlds, to answer your original question. But I think that this is why it's so important now more than ever that those of us who thrive in this analytical space and believe in it as much as I do, we need to be prepared to be the best communicators we can be, because we need to demand our seat at the table and not let our voice be taken from us and presumed as we're just the people in the back of the room crunching numbers all day. We can communicate, we should get stronger there, and we should be, if that's our pursuit, our career path, we should be fighting for that seat at the table.
Yeah. I mean, I do similar things like you with different organizations. I work in sports analytics, but I do also analytics stuff and you know, AI stuff in many other fields. And when I work with people in other fields, and sometimes they're doctors, sometimes they're oncologists, sometimes they're coaches, sometimes they're CEOs, sometimes they're people that work in blockchain. I've always put it on, it's on me to figure out what they need and how to learn their language in order to communicate to them. And I see that not so much as a responsibility or things like that, but it's a question of effectiveness. It's a question of, if you want that seat at the table, you know, you don't wait for them to pull the seat out. You figure out how to create the chair that belongs at the table. But taking that on as your responsibility. And it doesn't matter how, like, who I'm working with, you know, just because I have a PhD and I'm a professor, you know, I get right down into the mud to try and figure it out, because that's the only way that's going to be effective, and it's going to make them better. It's going to make me better, and it's going to make the whole thing more efficient. So being more proactive, I think, you know, especially students listening to this, be more proactive and listening, especially, right? Like the biggest skill is being able to listen, and then be able to start engaging with people on their terms. I think it's a really critical skill that seems like a soft skill, but it's a hard skill. It's actually a hard skill in organizations that make them work or make them fall apart, you know? We do better teaching it, to be perfectly honest. So,
and I think too, like, I think from both sides, humility to go with that as well. Here's the real deal, folks. When you go in to present your findings, I would wager that the majority of people you're presenting to do not understand your model. They don't know what regression is. They don't care. And we have to understand that in certain environments, that's okay. We, of course, demand the rigor and the responsibility of our work being on point, vetted, peer reviewed, et cetera, and so forth. But we have to have humility to understand that if we did hours and hours and hours of work and the result is one paragraph that says this is the player that matches what you need, if you've done that in a way that is accurate and accepted by your listener, that is success. Even though you know how much blood, sweat, and tears you poured into that project. They don't know, they don't care, they're never gonna get it. Just like they think you're never gonna understand how many hours they spend in the rink shooting the puck and how many times they put their skates on and shot, you know, with the light on over the garage. Let it go. Find the place that is essential to communicate and thrive there when you're together. Yeah,
yeah. I think that's, we've been provoking some thought in the chat here. I can see a bunch of things coming up. Alan's got some really great things we say. So people, please read the chat. We're running out of time. That's a great place to leave it. Alison, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. This has been a really intriguing and thoughtful discussion. It brings a lot to our group. And I can't believe this is number 20. Dave, when you said that earlier, I was just like, what, we've had 20 of these already? I mean, you probably know you've done every single one of them, but it's been an amazing, amazing time. So thank you very much, Alison. Please, everybody, if you can, you know, in your react, give her a hand. Thank you everybody for coming today. It was a great chat.
Thank you so much. And please, my contact information, the guys have it here. I'm also on Twitter at Alison L. Please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. It's my passion.
Check out her podcast. She made a podcast in COVID. So it's a really good podcast too. Check it out, please. And it's her and some other excellent professionals and women in the space actually. So it's a really good thing to check out. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get deeper into that today, but thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Before we break, that's all right. I'm just going to ask one final question and before I shut it down, but I was wondering, so you talked about, you know, that Peter, one of your final questions was about teams and, you know, working with the public. Alison, what about you? Like, you know, you're in a good position to recruit students or partner with citizens or whatnot. Have you done much of that and sort of help, like, have others do some of the legwork for you behind the scenes?
Yeah, I have a little bit, to be honest. I'm very adamant about paying for work. I don't like to ask for work for free. And so my resources, at least right now, are a little strapped, but I do pay online providers who provide some data for me. And any conference that I have helped arrange, any presenter, we have always managed, it may not always be huge, but found a way for a stipend. And that brings a great point, if I may. Anytime you see these conferences coming up, they are community oriented in nature, as we've talked about. Don't be afraid to submit a poster or a piece of work or a lightning talk. It's just 5 minutes. I'm happy to work through that with you. Come to those, make your work known. And even if I can't hire you, maybe someone who can will be right there.
Awesome. Right on. Well, thanks. I think we'll shut it down now. And looks like you're getting lots of thanks and compliments in the chat forum. So sounds like your insights very much resonated with our group. So thanks again. This has been tremendous. Peter, thanks for leading the conversation. I think Danny Chu is the one who suggested you as a speaker. So thanks to him. He's actually did join for a bit here. So yeah, this has been great. Thanks. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much. Danny, I love you. How are you?
You managed to catch the last 10 minutes. So that was great. Thanks for coming on, Alison.
Thank you for recommending me, Danny. You're the best.
Thanks.
Awesome. On that note, I'll shut down the recording. And thank you once again.